Well, so we're continuing in today's Mishnah Yomi. Today we will be learning Perek Aleph, Mishnayos Zayin through Ches. Chapter 1, Mishnayos 7 through 8. Writes Mishnah Zayin, Ein bein zav haroa shtei re'yos, the roa shalosh ela karban. So a zav is a man who experiences an emission. This is not the seminal emission, but it's another type of emission that really represents, or there really is a manifestation of some type of physical illness. So if a man has two emissions, there is no distinction between a man who has two emissions or three emissions. Either way, after experiencing two emissions or three emissions, halacha l'maisi, you have to observe 7 clean days. The only distinction between them is a karban. After 3 emissions, a person has to bring a karban as part of his purification process, but after 2 emissions, a karban is not needed, only the waiting of the 7 days. Ein bein mitzora muskar la mitzora muchlat. Mitzora is a person afflicted with saras. Saras we loosely translate as leprosy, but really, saras is a physical manifestation of a spiritual ailment. There is something called the mitzora muskar. Sometimes with the halachos of saras, the Kohen, who has to examine the individuals afflicted, may or may not know yet if this is really tzaras. Is it a discoloration? Is it a lesion? Or is it tzaras? So sometimes the patient, so to speak, is quarantined for 7 days to see what happens with the discoloration. Does it spread? Does it stay the same? Does it recede? That's called the Mitzora Muskar. He's locked away, he's quarantined to see what happens with the discoloration. So there is no distinction between a Mitzora Muskar and a Mitzora Muchlat. Muchlat means that he has been declared by the Kohen to be a Mitzora and is therefore Tameh, Ella Priya Uprima. The only distinction is Priya Uprima, that a Mitzora Muchlat, the person who has been declared as a Mitzora, the halacha is that he is obligated to tear his clothing and he's obligated to let his hair grow. So those obligations only apply to someone who is a bona fide Mitzora, declared Mitzora. Similarly, again, once the patient, will call him, if it turns out that after he's been locked away, quarantined for 7 days, and turns out that it wasn't saras, so therefore again he's free to go and he's tahar. So too again, after a person runs the course, let's say a person was declared as a mitzora, and then ultimately again they go through the purification process. So the Mishnah says there's no distinction between someone who becomes tahar at the end of his quarantine out of doubt versus someone who becomes tar at the end of his actual purification process, Ella tiglachas v'tziporim, except again for the obligation to cut one's hair and the bird offerings. Cutting the hair and the bird offerings are only associated with what we call a mitzora muchlat, which means an individual who was definitively declared as a mitzora. But someone who, let's say, was quarantined because of a suffix mitzora, perhaps he was mitzora, such a person, when he gets out of his quarantine, has no obligation to cut his hair, and certainly, again, has no obligations of bird offerings. That's the Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah Chas, 8th Mishnah. Ein bein svarim l'tfilin u'mezuzos. There is no distinction between svarim. Now, svarim in this context means individual scrolls of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. It's individual scrolls of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. There is no distinction, or for that matter, again, a scroll that is comprised of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. So there is no distinction between svarim, tefillin, and mezuzos. There's no distinction between svarim to tefillin and mezuzos. Tefillin, of course, refers to the parshios, the pieces of parchment upon which sections of the Torah are written that are inserted into tefillin or inserted into mezuzos. So there's no difference between the parshios written for scrolls of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim to parshios that are written for tefillin and mezuzos. Ella shasfarim nechtavim b'chal lashon, except that when a scroll is written for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, that could be written in any language. In any language, again, so you could use a different alphabet as well as a different language. Utfilin mezuzos einon nichtavos ela ashuris. But tefillin mezuzos, the parchments that get inserted into tefillin or into a mezuzah, could only be written in Hebrew, and again, with what we call ksav ashuris, which is the special kind of Hebrew that's used to write scrolls. So the Gemara says, inside the Mishnah says, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer af bisram lo etir sheyichtavu eli yavanis. Interesting enough, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, even by scrolls, the scrolls of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, you cannot write them in any lashon, in any language. Rather, the only license you have is to write them in Greek. The Gemara has a whole discussion over here that Greek, why Greek? So the Gemara explains based on the pasuk in Parshas Noach, Yaft Elokim liyafes v'yishkon ba'ohal Shem. That literally again Hashem gave beauty to Yefes, and that He will dwell in the tents of Shem. The tents of Shem, Shem is us, right? We are the descendants of Shem. Yefes, right, is Greece. So Rabbi Shimon says, based on the pasuk in Noach, there is this connection between the two sons of Noach, Yefes, which is Greece, Shem, which is Klal Yisrael, that Yefes can dwell within the tents of Shem. So Rabbi Shimon says, while it is true that you are allowed to go ahead and write scrolls of Tanakh in different languages, it is limited ultimately again to Greek. And in fact, that's how the Rambam paskins, like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. All right, we'll stop over here for today. Wishing everyone a wonderful day, another great day of Mishna Yomi. Shkayach everyone, Kol Tov.